The Winter War was between the Soviet Union and Finland. Beginning in late November of 1939 and stretching into March of 1940, the Winter War is an often forgotten conflict. However, it helped change the course of history. The Winter War was caused directly by the Non-Aggression Pact between the Nazis and the USSR. The pact had a secret side to it, in which each country would invade Poland from their respective sides. In addition, the Soviets would have the right to take Finland. After Poland fell in September of 1939, Russia sought to extend its influence into the Baltic region. Between September and October of the same year, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were all made to sign treaties providing mutual assistance, where Russia was allowed to establish military bases in all three Baltic states. It is widely assumed that Finland would be their next target. On the 12th of October, Russia began discussions with Finnish representatives in Moscow. To defend Leningrad, Stalin demanded several islands in the Gulf of Finland, as well as for the border to be moved further back. In addition, he wanted to establish military bases on Finnish soil. In return, he offered more than twice the land area, but in a less strategic position. The demands tore the Finnish government in half over what to do. They proposed a less generous offer, and as far as Stalin was concerned, negotiations were over. A quote from Stalin: "We cannot do anything about the geography, nor can you. Since Leningrad cannot be moved away, the frontier must be moved further off." Even though Germany urged Finland to accept the demands, the Finns were torn. By the end of November, war seemed inevitable. As war with Russia became more likely, patriotism took hold. No one was willing to tolerate an invasion of the homeland. The Soviets invaded with 45 divisions, totaling approximately 810,000 men, 6,000 tanks, and 3,900 aircraft. This dwarfed the Finnish army, who had a total of 337,000 men, 42 tanks, and 114 aircraft. The Finnish army was short of everything, including ammunition and uniforms. They also possessed a very remedial communication system. By all means, it looked like an easy victory for the Russians. However, the Red Army had been crippled by the Great Purges of 1937, in which more than 30,000 of army officers had been executed or imprisoned. This left the Soviets with few experienced medium and high-ranking officers, and therefore an ineffective chain of command. These conditions, combined with the weather and high morale in the Finnish forces, allowed Finland to resist the invasion far longer than was anticipated. At the start of the war, complete victory was expected within a few weeks. This was because just 2 months prior, the Soviets had invaded eastern Poland with less than 1,000 casualties. It was publicly announced that the invasion would take no longer than 2 weeks. Red Army troops were even warned not to accidentally cross the border into Sweden. The Red Army was used to battles on large open ground, and Finland's terrain was entirely different. They were almost always confined to the few roads running through the region, as their vehicles were unable to go off of them. The Russian army also had an ineffective chain of command. Commanders in the field could not make a decision without the approval of a higher officer, who usually had to get permission from another higher official. By these means, the Red Army was a slow-moving dinosaur. Finnish strategy was dictated by geography. The border between the Soviet Union and Finland was over 1,000 kilometers long, but mostly unpassable terrain. There were very few roads, and none of them were paved. The Finns were in an excellent position to defend their nation. They were also trained to use their own terrain to their advantage. Not only did they know their terrain, but the Finns also utilized the snow-covered forest by means of ski troops. Ski troops were very mobile and highly trained. The only weak point in their geography was in the south, where the terrain was easier to move through. However, this was fortified with what is known as the Matterheim line. Fortified with trenches, barbed wire, minefields, and other obstacles, the Matterheim line was an array of defensive structures located in Finland, about 30 to 75 kilometers from the border. The USSR deployed over 250,000 troops, facing around 130,000 Finns. Around 21,000 of Finland's troops were deployed directly in front of the line to delay the Soviet advance. The biggest problem in combat for the Finns was Soviet tanks. With none of their own, few anti-tank weapons, and even less anti-tank training, Finnish soldiers were not entirely sure what to do. However, the Soviet tank tactic was a basic frontal charge, without support from infantry. The Finns were able to exploit this and use logs and crowbars to jam the wheels and immobilize the tank. They eventually developed a weapon known as the Molotov cocktail, which was very effective. Maudie tactics were used extensively by the Finnish forces in the Winter War. It was especially effective against Soviet mechanized units, whom were restricted to long narrow roads. These roads meant they were trapped, with no way to move either backward or forward. Finnish soldiers used guerrilla tactics. They were skilled in cross-country skiing and used this advantage combined with speed to engage the vastly superior Russians. The Maudie tactics the Finns developed was a way for smaller numbers of Finns to encircle the Russians. Unlike the slow-moving Russian mechanized convoys, the Finnish troops were able to move quickly between the trees on cross-country skis. This allowed them to split up a convoy and attack sections individually. Soviet generals attempted to base their attack strategy off of German blitzkrieg tactics. However, these were effective in Central Europe, which had a wide network of well-paved and well-mapped roads. Finland was completely different, with impassable terrain and very few roads. The blitzkrieg was also designed to incorporate all branches of the German military. By comparison, the Russian branches all acted as separate entities. The Russian Air Force was also limited by the short duration of the days in the winter months. This rendered Soviet tactics ineffective. The Red Army was not prepared for a war in the winter. It possessed plenty of standard military equipment, yet little was adequate for the conditions of Finland. White camouflage was not issued until late in the war, and Russian vehicles couldn't deal with the cold. In addition, the winter of 1939 through 1940 was incredibly severe. The temperature was exceptionally cold, reaching record low temperatures of -43 degrees Celsius. Several Soviet units experienced casualties due to frostbite as high as 10% before even crossing into Finland. At the start of the war, only previously active Finnish servicemen possessed uniforms and weapons. Many had to supply their own clothing. They had the advantage of near constant darkness, as well as extreme weather conditions. Retreat was unacceptable to the Red Army. Cowards who tried to flee or surrender were shot by their own men. On the 12th of December, the Finns achieved their first major victory of the war. 2 Soviet rifle divisions were defeated by a much smaller Finnish force. The Battle of Suomussalmi and the Battle of Great Road were fought from December 1939 through January of 1940. On December 7th, a Soviet division captured the town of Suomussalmi, but found that they were trapped deep behind Finnish lines. Another division was sent to aid them. However, over the next week, an outnumbered Finnish division halted and defeated all involved Soviet forces. This fight showcased Maudie tactic effectiveness. Estimated Russian casualties were over 17,000 killed, as opposed to just 402 Finns who were confirmed dead. As spring approached, Finnish troops were quick to bury Soviet dead in order to reduce disease. By the end of the first month, nothing of great value had been achieved. This did not please Stalin. He tried to pass off the failings to the public as a result of harsh climate, bad terrain, and even claimed that the Americans had sent 1,000 elite pilots to Finnish aid. With the knowledge that previous attempts had been unsuccessful, the Red Army began preparing for a major offensive on December 26th. A new army was created specifically for the Finnish front. It was decided that frontal assaults would no longer be allowed because of the massive casualties. Instead, the Russians adopted a more tactical advance that worked in steps. On the 15th of January, a systematic artillery bombardment of Finnish positions was initiated. On February 1st, the USSR launched a major offensive. Tanks attacked first, with infantry literally in tow on sleds behind the tanks. Instead of being slaughtered, the Finns would retreat during the day and return at night to rebuild the bunkers. This was exhausting, however, and wore down the Finnish troops. By February 11th, a breakthrough had been achieved. The Finnish troops were so exhausted that parts in the line simply collapsed. By the 17th, Finns had withdrawn from the Mannerheim line. On the 25th of February, the Finns attempted a counterattack using the 15 tanks they still possessed. Ironically, this caused panic among Finnish troops, who did not know Finland had any tanks. They believed the Russians had encircled them. The USSR also shipped massive amounts of tanks and artillery to the battlefield, and increased the troop involvement to over 600,000 men. Attacks now took place using artillery and tank support, as well as smoke screens. Although tactics were changed and morale improved, generals still accepted heavy losses in order to capture their objectives. Simo Häyhä was a sniper who served in the Finnish army from 1925 through 1940. The Red Army nicknamed him White Death because he was confirmed to have killed over 700 Soviet troops. He is credited with the highest number of sniper kills in any war, with 505 confirmed. All of these were accomplished with his Mosin Nagant variant rifle, the White Guard M2830 Pistikorva. He is also credited with 200 kills with a Suomi 9mm submachine gun. He accomplished all of this in just under 100 days, with limited hours of daylight to work with. He dressed in completely white camouflage and worked in temperatures between -20 degrees Celsius and -40 degrees. He was so successful because he pioneered very unorthodox sniper tactics. Instead of a scope, he preferred to use iron sights. By doing this, he could present a smaller target for the enemy, since a sniper has to raise his head higher to use the scope. By doing this, he also avoided glare from the glass on the scope giving away his position. He also didn't have to deal with the glass fogging, which was very common in cold weather. The Soviets tried several methods to rid of him, including counter-snipers and artillery strikes, none of which were effective. On the 6th of March, he was shot in the jaw by a Russian soldier during combat. He was picked up by his fellow troops, who are quoted as saying, "Half of his cheek is missing, but he is not dead." Häyhä regained consciousness the day peace was declared, the 13th of March. He was later awarded the first and second class medals for liberty. Although Finland tried constantly to reopen negotiation with Russia during the war, the Soviets did not respond. By the middle of February, it was becoming apparent that the Finnish army was exhausted. The Finnish government was unwilling to negotiate on these terms, but their military situation put them in no situation to argue. The defensive line was crumbling, and help from the UK, France, and Sweden was not coming. For the Soviets, casualties were astronomically high. The situation became an embarrassment for the Soviet Union. In addition to Finland and the USSR, Sweden and Germany were also pushing for the war to end. On the 25th of February, Soviet peace terms were spelled out in detail. By March 5th, Finland accepted the terms as a basis for negotiation. The Finns opened talks with the USSR on March the 8th. But because this was a full week past the Russian set deadline for negotiation, the conditions were harsher. The Finnish government was outraged, yet to avoid total annihilation, they had little choice but to accept. On March 13th, the Treaty of Moscow was signed, ending hostilities by 11 a.m. It is believed that the reason Stalin did not command his vastly superior military to continue to conquer Finland is because he was worried more about the bigger picture. He saw war with Nazi Germany as inevitable. The end result saw 127,000 Russians dead, 187,000 wounded, and 6,000 captured. 26,000 Finns had been killed, 44,000 wounded, and 1,000 captured. The Winter War may not have been the most crucial conflict of World War II, but it gave the Russians well-needed combat experience that later helped them to defeat Nazi Germany.